Diana had left the daily machinery of royal life, but the machinery had not released her. Invitations changed. Friendships became cautious. Private messages carried hidden warnings. The palace no longer needed to issue direct orders, because decades of royal influence had created a network capable of applying pressure without leaving fingerprints. At first, the pressure was almost impossible to prove. Nothing arrived stamped with an official command. No senior figure openly told Diana where she could go, whom she could trust, or how she should speak. Instead, control moved through protocol, access, security, charity boards, and private loyalties. A dinner invitation would quietly disappear. A familiar supporter would become suddenly unavailable. An organization once eager to welcome her might hesitate after an unexplained conversation with someone closer to the royal establishment. That was what made the system so effective. It did not need to attack her directly. It only needed to remind others that palace approval still carried influence, prestige, and protection. People who had once treated Diana with warmth began choosing their words carefully around her. Some created distance. Others avoided being photographed beside her. Even trusted friendships could no longer feel entirely safe, because Diana had begun to understand that affection and loyalty were not always the same thing. The emotional cost was brutal. She had fought for independence, believing it would bring peace, yet freedom seemed to come with a new kind of loneliness. She could make her own decisions, but every decision appeared to trigger another warning. She was allegedly advised to reconsider interviews, foreign travel, public appearances, clothing choices, and the people entering her private circle. The warnings were rarely presented as threats. They arrived disguised as concern. Security advice, reputation management, protection for the children, procedure, always procedure. But Diana had lived inside the palace long enough to recognize when concern became control. Then came the stories. Reports portraying her as emotional, impulsive, demanding, or unstable appeared with suspicious timing. Private details reached the press. Conversations seemed to travel farther than they should have. Diana began asking the question that would haunt her final years. Were these leaks random? Or was someone building a public case against her? Silence no longer felt safe. If she withdrew, others could define her. If she spoke, they could accuse her of disloyalty. So she began using public visibility as a shield. Every humanitarian visit, every warm exchange, and every unscripted moment reminded the world that she was more than the troubled figure described in hostile headlines. Yet even this strategy carried danger, because her popularity made the institution more cautious, not less. She wanted calm. She wanted privacy, but she also knew that disappearing could be mistaken for surrender, and she could never become completely separate from the monarchy. She was still the mother of William, the future king, and Harry, the spare whose life would also be shaped by duty, comparison, and inherited pain. Her title could be altered. Her access could be restricted. Her reputation could be challenged. But her place in the royal bloodline could not be erased. That was where the pressure was always heading. Not toward her wardrobe, her interviews, or her public image, but toward the deepest bond she possessed. And when palace control moved closer to William and Harry, Diana's struggle stopped being only about her own freedom. It became a battle over what kind of future her children would inherit. The monarchy could tolerate Diana becoming independent, but it could never ignore her influence over two boys standing directly inside the royal succession. William and Harry were not merely her sons. They were heirs to an institution, and every lesson Diana gave them threatened to reshape the crown from within. By Diana's final years, motherhood had become more than the deepest bond in her life. It had become the center of a silent struggle over the future of the monarchy itself. The palace saw William and Harry through the cold language of duty, succession, preparation, and responsibility. Diana saw two children who needed warmth before discipline, honesty before ceremony, and love before expectation. That difference mattered. She wanted them to understand ordinary life, not simply observe it from behind royal protection. She wanted them to meet people who had suffered, to recognize fear, loneliness, illness, and poverty without turning away. To Diana, compassion was not a weakness. It was the one quality capable of saving them from becoming prisoners of privilege. But inside the royal system, emotion was often treated as something to control. Pain was endured quietly. Anger was hidden. Personal wounds were buried beneath duty. Diana reportedly feared that this training could teach her sons how to perform strength without ever learning how to heal. William carried the heavier burden. Even as a boy, he understood that his future had already been decided. One day, his private feelings might be forced to surrender to public responsibility. Diana could see the conflict growing inside him. The son who wanted to protect his mother and the future king expected to remain loyal to the institution she believed had wounded her. Harry's position was different, but no less painful. He was close to the crown, yet always placed behind his brother. He could feel the tension surrounding his parents without possessing the authority to change it. More openly emotional and more vulnerable to the family's divisions, he faced the pressure of being both essential and secondary. A prince whose importance was constantly measured against someone else's destiny. Behind closed doors, the struggle allegedly reached into every part of their lives. Holidays, school arrangements, security, travel, public appearances, and private schedules became questions of authority. Who decided where the boys would spend their time? Who shaped their understanding of the separation? Who controlled the story they were being told about their mother? Diana feared that her closeness with them was being treated as a danger to royal discipline. She believed some advisors wanted the princes protected not only from scandal, but from her emotional influence. Yet she refused to prepare William for the crown by teaching him to become cold. She wanted him to understand the institution without allowing it to erase his humanity. Because inheritance was never only about estates, jewels, titles, or bloodlines. Families also passed down silence, resentment, fear, emotional distance. The hidden damage of marriages built around duty rather than love. Diana knew enough about royal compromise to fear that history might repeat itself through her sons. And that was why her influence could not be easily removed. Even if her reputation was attacked, the lessons she gave William and Harry could remain inside them for decades. Her voice might be challenged in public, but it had already entered the future of the crown. Diana began to understand that protecting her sons would require more than private reassurance. She would have to become clearer, stronger, and harder to dismiss. She could not rely on closed-door promises when the institution held the greater power. To protect the future, Diana began using the one force the palace had never fully mastered: the emotional loyalty of millions who believed her pain more readily than they believed royal statements. The palace controlled ceremonies, titles, residences, and official announcements. Diana controlled something far more dangerous: attention. A single appearance could overshadow a royal event. A quiet gesture could become a global image. Without a throne or formal command, she had become the monarchy's most powerful emotional rival. Public sympathy was no longer simply surrounding Diana. She was learning how to turn it into influence. The palace could reduce her official duties, question her choices, and distance her from royal ceremony. But it could not command the emotions of millions who felt they understood her suffering. That loyalty gave Diana a freedom no title could provide. She no longer needed permission to matter. Her charitable work began to change with her. It became more direct, personal, and emotionally exposed. She moved toward causes that carried discomfort, illness, homelessness, landmines, and people society preferred not to see. Where royal appearances often depended on careful distance, Diana closed the space between herself and those she met. She listened. She touched. She looked people directly in the eye. Those simple acts created enormous power. Her closeness did not feel like performance to the public. It felt human. Yet that authenticity allegedly created anxiety inside royal circles, because every warm exchange made traditional ceremony appear colder by comparison. Diana was not openly attacking the monarchy, but her behavior exposed a contrast the palace could not easily explain. She showed that compassion did not require a script, and dignity did not always require distance. Still, her influence was not entirely calculated. Beneath the confidence was a woman who had spent years feeling rejected, controlled, and emotionally abandoned. Helping others gave her something royal life had often denied her: proof that she was useful, needed, valued. Her public work became both mission and refuge, allowing her to transform private pain into connection. But attention was never safe. The same newspapers that praised her courage could question her motives the following morning. One photograph could present her as fearless and compassionate. Another could be used to describe her as reckless, wounded, or desperate for attention. Every appearance became part of a larger battle over her identity. Was she an independent humanitarian, a damaged former princess, or a woman manipulating public sympathy? Diana understood the danger. The public could protect her, but it could also consume her suffering as entertainment. Her heartbreak sold newspapers. Her loneliness became speculation. Even her strongest moments could be turned against her. Yet the possibility of retreat carried its own risk. Royal advisors allegedly feared that Diana might build a permanent international role beyond Britain. Supported by global charities, influential friendships, and an audience larger than anything the palace could control, she was no longer simply surviving outside the institution. She was creating an alternative form of royalty based on emotion rather than rank. But independence demanded a new identity, and Diana still carried symbols from the life she was trying to escape. Her clothes, jewels, wealth, and public image remained tied to a world that had both elevated and wounded her. Could she truly become free while wearing reminders of royal belonging? That question became impossible to avoid when Diana began reclaiming the jewels, dresses, and symbols that once represented palace ownership and turning them into evidence of her escape. Inside royal life, jewelry was never merely decoration. Every pearl, sapphire, diamond, and borrowed tiara carried rank, loyalty, inheritance, and permission. When Diana began changing how she wore or refused to wear those symbols, the palace allegedly understood the message. She was rewriting royal language in public. For generations, royal jewels had spoken without words. A tiara could announce acceptance. A necklace could signal favor. A borrowed piece could remind everyone that access depended on obedience, because many of the grandest objects did not truly belong to the woman wearing them. They belonged to the family, the crown, or the system surrounding both. Beauty came with conditions. Diana had once worn those symbols as proof that she belonged. The sapphires, pearls, diamonds, and formal gowns helped create the image of a princess living inside a perfect royal story. But as her marriage broke apart, the meaning changed. Pieces once linked to romance began carrying memories of humiliation, loneliness, and promises that had failed behind closed doors. The jewels still shone. Diana no longer saw them in the same way. That was why her fashion choices became more than style. Each change appeared to carry a message. She moved away from the heavy grandeur expected of a royal wife and toward sharper, cleaner, more confident choices that placed control back in her own hands. The palace had once dressed her as part of an institution. Now Diana was dressing herself as an individual. Yet ownership remained complicated. Some pieces had been personal gifts. Others were connected to royal access, family tradition, or loans that could disappear when her official position changed. This created an uncomfortable question. After giving years of her life to the monarchy, which symbols could she truly keep? There were also forbidden pieces. The tiaras and historic jewels she could no longer borrow, wear, or claim once she stepped outside official royal life. Losing access was not simply about luxury. Those objects had once made her visible to the world, yet they had never made her emotionally secure. Their disappearance exposed the truth beneath the glamour. The palace could decorate a woman without protecting her. Diana answered that loss by transforming her appearance into a language of survival. A bold dress could communicate anger without an interview. A stripped-back look could announce freedom without a public statement. Fashion became her armor, but unlike royal jewels, it belonged to her choices. She also understood that her possessions might one day pass to William and Harry. Jewelry, letters, dresses, and private objects could become emotional evidence of the mother they had known beyond ceremony. What looked like inheritance on paper might carry grief, memory, and unresolved questions into the next generation. That possibility allegedly unsettled the palace. Diana's personal belongings could become more powerful than treasures locked inside royal vaults, because the public connected them to a woman, not merely an institution. Her dresses could tell a story of rebellion. Her jewelry could preserve both love and betrayal. Her private letters could reveal what polished statements concealed. Soon, the struggle would no longer concern what Diana wore. It would concern who controlled her belongings, her memories, and the meaning attached to them. And as Diana gained control over her image, the palace allegedly became increasingly concerned about something no vault could contain: the private truth she might reveal about life behind royal doors. Diana knew where the monarchy hid its pain. She had witnessed the private arguments behind public smiles, the emotional bargains beneath royal marriages, and the quiet punishments used against those who disrupted the system. The palace did not know how much she would reveal, or when she might reveal it. That knowledge had become her greatest source of power. Diana understood how royal crises were managed, how difficult conversations were delayed, and how public statements could be carefully shaped to hide private damage. She knew which relationships were genuine, which loyalties depended on position, and how quickly the institution could close ranks when its image was threatened. Her earlier disclosures had already proved that she was willing to challenge the official version of events. She had spoken about loneliness, betrayal, and emotional suffering in a way the palace could not easily dismiss. Once she broke that silence, a dangerous possibility emerged. What else did she know? More importantly, what evidence might she have kept? There were alleged fears surrounding letters, private notes, recordings, diaries, and personal accounts. Any one of them could have damaged reputations protected by years of ceremony and silence. A single document might contradict a public denial. A private conversation could expose how decisions were really made. Even the suggestion that such material existed was enough to create tension. But Diana's motives were never simple. She wanted to defend herself. She wanted the world to understand that her pain had not been invented, and that her reactions had not appeared without cause. Yet, she also feared what complete exposure might do to William and Harry. The monarchy was not only the institution she believed had wounded her, it was also the inheritance waiting for her sons. That created a moral line she could never ignore. Speaking to protect herself was one thing. Speaking in a way that destroyed others, and perhaps damaged the future crown, was something else entirely. Diana may have struggled to decide where honesty ended and revenge began. Around her, different voices pulled in different directions. Some advisors, journalists, and confidants encouraged her to reveal more, arguing that silence only protected those who had failed her. Others warned that once certain truths became public, they could never be contained again. Every disclosure promised freedom, but it also carried consequences she could not fully predict. The palace allegedly feared she might expose more than personal betrayal. She understood how loyalty could be demanded, how emotional suffering was minimized, and how inconvenient family members could be isolated while official language presented unity. Secrets involving marriage, succession, money, security, and private rivalries could move beyond scandal and become politically dangerous. That knowledge made Diana powerful, but it also made her vulnerable. The more isolated she became, the harder it was to know who could be trusted. Leaks and counter-leaks created confusion. One person might offer protection while quietly feeding information elsewhere. Another might encourage her to speak for reasons that had little to do with her safety. Diana was surrounded by attention, yet increasingly unsure which relationships were real. As her international profile grew, the possibility of a larger platform became more alarming. Another interview, a personal account, or a permanent global role could allow her to tell her story without palace control. The institution no longer feared only what Diana had already revealed. It feared the words she was still holding back. But before Diana could define the next chapter in her own words, a new relationship carried her beyond palace boundaries and into a world the monarchy understood even less. Diana's private life had always been treated as public property, but her final relationships created a deeper royal panic. A new partner could offer affection, escape, and an international future. Yet he could also bring unfamiliar loyalties, private influence, and the possibility that Diana might permanently leave the palace's orbit. After years of feeling watched, rejected, and judged, Diana was no longer searching only for romance. She was searching for emotional safety. She wanted to believe there could be a life in which she was loved as a woman, not examined as a royal symbol, managed as a public problem, or valued only for the title she once carried. That longing made affection feel powerful. A warm voice could soften years of cold negotiation. Attention could make her feel chosen after a marriage in which she had often felt pushed aside. Yet the very intensity that offered comfort also created danger. Diana had spent so long living without emotional security that a promise of escape could become almost impossible to resist. The palace would have viewed any serious partner through a harsher lens. Reputation, wealth, religion, nationality, security, political connections. Access to William and Harry, a private relationship involving Diana, could never remain completely private, because the man beside her might eventually influence the mother of a future king. That possibility changed everything. Around Diana, motives were not always easy to read. Some people were drawn to her pain. Others were attracted to her fame, her global reach, or the doors her name could open. Money, power, media interest, and personal loyalty could become tangled together. Even genuine affection could exist beside ambition, making trust more difficult at the moment Diana needed it most. Foreign travel offered temporary distance from Britain and the pressure surrounding royal life. Away from familiar palace networks, she could imagine a future less restricted by old rules. But distance did not bring invisibility. It increased fascination. Private holidays became international stories. Every movement drew cameras. Every relationship produced speculation. Royal concern allegedly deepened around the possibility that Diana might create a second life outside the United Kingdom. A permanent home abroad, an international partner, or a global humanitarian role could weaken palace influence over her choices. It could also create painful questions about William and Harry. Where would their mother live? Who would surround her? How would that affect their loyalties, their security, and their place inside the royal system? Diana's hope was real, but so was the uncertainty beneath it. Was she moving toward freedom, or entering another world where powerful people controlled access, information, and protection? Was she finally choosing her own future, or placing that future in hands she did not fully understand? Events began moving faster. Media pursuit intensified. Security decisions carried greater risk. The line between private happiness and public danger grew thinner with every passing day. Control was slipping, not only from the palace, but from Diana, her advisors, the press, and everyone fighting to shape what came next. The final struggle would no longer be about whether Diana still belonged to royalty. It would be about who controlled the meaning of her life if she was no longer there to explain it. Then, in a single devastating moment, every private struggle became public history, and the institution that could not control Diana in life faced an even greater challenge after her death. The palace had spent years trying to contain Diana's influence, but her death removed the final limits around it. Grief became anger. Flowers became accusation. Silence became evidence. The monarchy now faced a force larger than scandal, a public determined to decide for itself what Diana had represented. In death, Diana was no longer only a former princess caught inside a bitter royal conflict. She became something far more powerful, a global symbol of compassion, vulnerability, and resistance. The arguments that once surrounded her were overwhelmed by shock. People who had followed her pain now felt they had lost someone who had understood theirs. That grief exposed a dangerous distance between palace tradition and public emotion. The monarchy moved cautiously, guided by protocol, restraint, and old expectations. But the public wanted warmth, recognition, visible sorrow. Every delay appeared cold. Every carefully measured statement seemed inadequate. Every ceremonial decision was examined for signs of the hostility people believed Diana had faced while alive. Silence, once used to protect the institution, now worked against it. At the center stood William and Harry. They carried Diana's emotional influence, but they also carried the future of the crown. Their grief was private, yet the world watched them as symbols of a divided inheritance. From their mother came openness, compassion, and suspicion of systems that hid pain. From the monarchy came duty, discipline, and the demand to keep moving. Diana's funeral became more than a farewell. It felt like an unofficial judgment on the institution that had never fully understood her. The public was not only mourning a woman, it was confronting the royal culture that had shaped her suffering and struggled to respond to her death. Then, the battle over memory began. Her jewels, dresses, letters, photographs, and personal possessions were no longer ordinary belongings. They became pieces of history. Some passed through family inheritance. Others entered charitable collections, exhibitions, archives, and public mythology. Each object carried a different version of Diana: the princess, the mother, the rebel, the wounded wife, the global humanitarian. For William and Harry, the deepest inheritance could not be displayed. They inherited distrust of the press, complicated feelings toward palace advisors, emotional wounds, and competing ideas about duty. Their later choices would repeatedly return the monarchy to questions first raised during Diana's final years. The palace attempted to place her safely back inside royal history. honoring her compassion while avoiding the full criticism her life represented. But each later marriage, interview, public conflict, and family departure reopened the old wound. Diana's story refused to remain in the past. That was the central irony. The harder the institution had tried to reduce her influence, the more powerful her memory became. Her final years were not merely an escape from royal control. They marked a permanent change in how the world judged monarchy, marriage, motherhood, and silence. The palace could alter titles, restrict access, reclaim royal property, and issue carefully written statements. But it could never fully control the story Diana had already placed inside the hearts of millions. Because Diana's final victory was not that she escaped the palace completely, it was that, long after its doors closed behind her, the palace was still being forced to answer the questions she had left behind.